I guess since had on the ark, floodlights. Floodlights. It was a good one. And that's how my jokes go at Chisholm Hills, too. Nobody ever laughs at those either. That's all right. I'm used to it by now. Yeah, another thing about that day when me and Brandon filled in for Tom Holland, we were second-year students at the School of Preaching when all that happened. And like a week before, I had broken my shoulder. So I was in like a brace, and B.J. Clark made me wear a coat. So I preached on that stage with one arm dangling out of my coat because my shoulder was broken. It was a miserable experience, but that's all right. I really appreciated being able to fill in on that day. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, we'll key in on verse number 7. The topic given to me tonight was the man Noah, and there was all kinds of directions, obviously, we could have gone in. There are verses like Genesis 6 and verse number 9 where it says that these are the generations of Noah, that Noah was a just man, or he was a perfect man in all of his generations. There was the one right before that in verse number 8 that says that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It said of Noah that he walked with God. And so there's all kinds of things that draw us in to the man Noah. But Hebrews 11 is what really got my attention. And there was a couple of reasons that it got my attention. First and foremost, because of who Noah follows. The three people that are before Noah that are extremely important to notice are Abel, Enoch, and then Noah. And what's interesting about all three of these men in Hebrews 11 is the fact that they all three pleased God. It says of Abel that his sacrifice was accepted by God, or that God received his sacrifice, thus meaning that God was pleased by what Abel offered. But then you have Enoch, who it says there in verse 5, that he was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now therefore, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Then in verse number 7, it says of Noah, by faith, who being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household, and by this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. These lives that these men lived were spent in such communion with God that it says that they pleased him. In fact, I'm particularly drawn to Enoch and Noah because remember it said that they walked with God, and their lives were spent in such constant communion with God that it was like their lives were spent walking hand in hand with God. That's a pretty amazing thing to think about for me when it comes to Noah. But when you think about those two men, Enoch and Noah, their walks were a little bit different, weren't they? You know, Enoch in a way was lucky. Enoch didn't have to live as long, I guess, in the world maybe as Noah did. And when the generation got evil and difficult, Enoch didn't have to last as long. He was taken. He got to go up into heaven and be with God. And in a way, you would think that's probably a blessing. Wouldn't you and I like to just go up and be with God? See, Noah was different, though. Noah's walk led him through a difficult place. A place where he had to learn how to live as a Christian or as a follower of God in a place and around people that didn't want to be followers of God. That at a moment's notice when Noah lived out his faith, everyone ridiculed him for doing the things that he did. They didn't understand why Noah did what he did. They didn't understand why Noah had made such a commitment. They didn't understand why Noah, even in Hebrews 11, it says, with things unseen, was so committed to doing what he thought was right. They didn't understand that. And really, the generation that Noah preached to for 120 years is a generation no different than what we're dealing with today. And so I think it's really important that we try to understand the man Noah and what about Noah's faith makes him such an attractive person to study tonight, and why his faith is what we're going to key in on tonight as we study from Hebrews chapter 11. What I really wanted to do was to get through these 3 points, but I don't know that that's going to happen, so we'll just really focus on the first, and then we'll make light of the second, because in Hebrews 11 and verse 7, I think these three things are evident. You'll notice that it introduces Noah this way. He says, by faith. Before you can ever move forward with talking about Noah, you have to understand that faith was first. It was fundamental in who Noah was. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But then you'll see, as a result of Noah's faith, fear was his motivation. And this is a healthy fear. This isn't the fact that he was afraid of God, but that he respected God deeply. And it was his motivation. Faith was his foundation. Fear was his motivation. And as a result of those things, obedience was his result. That's right there in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse number 7. In reverent fear, he constructed an ark for the saving of his household, and by this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. He, faithful to God, feared God, obeyed God. Let's notice then tonight this faith. I think this is going to be really good study. It was for me, at least, to emphasize his faith, and I hope maybe there's something that you can take from this as well. Number one, Noah had faith in the ordinary life, in the everyday life, if you will. When we think about this phrase, by faith Noah, when we try to understand what Noah's faith looked like and what that meant, naturally what we understand is that God had to have seen something in Noah's everyday life to choose him before the big test came. God looked at Noah and said, I trust you enough based on the way that you've lived to take you and your family into the ark, and I'm going to literally obliterate everyone else. Noah had to have been something special in his everyday life for God to have taken notice of him in that way. Would you agree? That there was something special about Noah in his everyday life that drew God to him. In fact, that word just man in Genesis 6 and verse 9 that we mentioned, that Noah was a just man and perfect in all his generation, that meant that he was a righteous man, that he actually lived a righteous life. And we know from the New Testament that the just do what? They live by faith. God said, that's a just man. Noah lives by faith every day of his life. Now, it's a good thing to have faith in the hard times. Would you agree? It's a good thing to have faith in the hard times. The New Testament teaches us how to have faith in the hard times. But what I admire about Noah is that God saw he had faith in the everyday, ordinary times. Not just the hard. Before the big test came, Noah was ready and prepared. And so what that means for me is that I must consider, do I have faith when it comes to my marriage? Do I have faith when it comes to my family? Do I have faith when it comes to my job and my finances and the way that I live and interact with this world, Christian or non-Christian, every single day? Because Noah did. And this is another thing I found really interesting about Noah, and maybe our faith too. Noah wasn't he didn't have a renter kind of faith. He had a homeowner kind of faith. It wasn't a faith that was here and gone. When times got difficult, he was off, and then when they were good, he was on again, like so many of us seem to be. Noah was there for the long haul. And I like that about him. But let me just point out this, I guess, when it comes to his ordinary faith. Noah did everything before the day came. And I think that's really important. You notice that Noah did not wait until the rain came to build the ark. Do you know that? We know that. When we read the Old Testament, the account of Noah, we know for a fact that he did not wait until the day the rain came, which tells me that Noah took serious every day that he had. That faith in God and commitment to God was something that was on the forefront of his mind long before the actual event came. Now, we can take that in two ways. Number one, we know Sunday's coming. And Sunday's not the only day where our faith should just be on the forefront of our mind. That in the ordinary every day, we know Sunday's coming. Why not live like Sunday's coming every day? Why not think about our faith every day? Why not be conscious of our relationship with God and commitment every day leading up to that day? But then we know that great and final day is coming, the judgment day. When we stand before God, when we either hear, well done, my good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I don't know you. We know that day's coming. So why not emphasize having faith in the ordinary, everyday life? I think that's really important and fundamental in understanding by faith Noah. He had faith in the everyday, ordinary. Number two, notice this about Noah's faith. Noah also had faith in the warnings of God. Now that seems a little bit weird when we listen to it, but when we think about what that means, faith in God's promises is really important. For us to have faith in God's promises and in the nice things that God says and in the easy things to understand, it's important for us to have faith in those things. But I also think it's really important for us to have faith in the warnings. Faith in the promises is good, but we're not necessarily going to have complete faith in God if we're not conscious of His warnings. In other words, if I don't believe that God will punish sin, then I probably don't believe that God will pardon it either, right? Is the idea. I have to believe, if I believe that God's going to pardon sin, I also have to be aware that God is going to punish sin. And if I doubt God's word in one thing, then it's likely I'm going to have small confidence in the other areas as well. So what we're saying about Noah is the fact that he believed that God would save his family, but he also believed that God was serious when he said, hey, a flood is coming. Noah believed God's warning. I think that's really important. If Noah had not built the ark, Noah would not have been saved. Noah wouldn't have built the ark if he didn't believe that there was actually going to have been a flood. I think about all of the warnings in the scriptures, and I remember tomorrow you're going to be blessed to hear Brother Grider preach. Brother Barry Grider's coming, I think, if that's right. Jonathan, is that right? I remember a sermon that Brother Grider preached years ago called Why I Want to Be a Christian. And the first point in his sermon called Why I Want to Be a Christian is because he didn't want to go to hell. That's what he said. I want to be a Christian because I don't want to go to hell. In other words, it told me that he was conscious of the fact that just as sure that God could deliver his soul if he did what God wanted him to, God could also punish his soul if he didn't. And that's the idea. Noah took God seriously. I know you'll save me if I do what you say, but God, I know you're serious if you don't. A lot more people I know in the faith could be a lot more serious about what God says in the good and in the bad. Noah had faith in God's warnings. Number 3, let me say this too. If I grow to a place in my faith where I stand in awe of God's warnings, then His mercy on that great day will be so much sweeter. Number 3, Noah had faith in what seemed to be impossible. Noah had faith in what seemed to be impossible. Did you know that in Noah's day there was not a manufacturing plant in the industrial park that Noah could go down and pick out a manufactured ark? He didn't have that. He didn't have a Bass Pro Shop to go and pick out a new Bass Tracker ark, or John, the used boat salesman, to call and bring him what he had on his lot. He didn't have that luxury. And I don't know that there was a river where Noah was living. You know, I don't know that Noah could actually build the boat on the river. It seems to me that he would have been building it on dry land. That's the way Evan Almighty makes it look, so it must be true, right? He was building it on dry land. So what tells me is this, that the circumstances in which Noah was building were less than ideal. And we also know that the only water that they had seen on earth was in the garden, and it was mist, so it wasn't rain, much less enough rain to cover the entire earth for 150 days, Genesis chapter 7 and verse number 24, right? It's amazing to think that what Noah was staring at when God gave him that command was seemingly impossible. Now let me tell you what I know about God before we talk about Noah. What I know about God is that throughout the story of the Scripture, God always does things that are beyond the capabilities of man, so as to convince man and to help him understand that it's all God and not him. God does the impossible so that we realize that it's nothing that we have done or can do. It's all God. Noah knew that. Noah knew that God was putting something in front of him that without God and commitment to God, it was going to be impossible. And Noah never wavered. And that's what I admire so much about his faith, because he believed the Lord and he did it. And let me tell you this is what I've learned in just a few years. Faith that believes in the probable, that's anyone's faith. But faith that believes in the impossible, that's biblical faith. Do you remember what Luke 1 verse 37, the angel said to Mary? But with God, all things are possible. Faith that believes in the impossible is biblical faith. Dan Winkler said one time, and this is probably my favorite quote of any preacher I've ever heard. He said, if God is your partner, dream big. Dream big. Noah is admirable in a lot of ways, for a lot of reasons. mainly because of the way he lived his faith in the ordinary life. To me, that's a huge thing, because it seems to me what we lack most of all in our churches, and I'm not sure how it is here in Pulaski, but in Florence, where the church is so overwhelming. There's a church on every quarter. On average, our members at Chisholm Hills pass 9 churches of Christ in order to get to worship at Chisholm Hills. It's insane to me. And it seems like the overwhelming majority of people, what they lack most is everyday faith. They'll show up on Sunday. They'll show up on Wednesday. But in between is where we lack. Noah was that guy. Noah knew that God was going to make good on his promises for the good to save his family, but he also knew that God was serious about punishment if he didn't do what he said. Noah had faith in his warnings. Number 3, Noah had faith in what seemed to be impossible. God, you want me to build an ark. There's no river. I can't even build it on the water. That's right, build it on dry land. God, you want me to bring 2 of every kind of animal in here. How did he light it? How did he feed them? How did he clean it? I don't know. But God handled it. That's all I know. Noah had faith in what seemed to be impossible. Number 4, Noah had faith even though he was alone. Noah had faith even though he was alone. That makes Noah a man worth admiring. You know, I was thinking to myself when I sat down in here that this is one of the few times this summer that I've gone somewhere other than Chisholm Hills. I didn't commit to a lot this summer, and I'm so thankful that events like this are happening again, because for the longest time they weren't. And I look around tonight and I see an auditorium of people that are here, and you look around and you see other believers, and you can't help but be encouraged by the amount of people who think and want the same things you do, right? I love that. I love that we can be here together. I was so excited to come to East Hill because you guys were so good to me while I was in school, and I appreciate that. But when I look around at so many people I know, I have to ask myself the question, how would I fare if I were in Noah's shoes, if I were alone? If it was just me and my wife and my kids and their wives, how would we fare as Christians in our faith if it was just us? And all the people around us were saying, you're crazy for believing in God. You're crazy for building that boat. Noah, are you serious? You really actually believe this is going to happen? And so in the middle of you trying to actually live out what you believe, the commitment that you've made to God, everyone else is ridiculing you and shaming you and putting you down for what you believe. Can you imagine then how difficult it must have been for Noah to keep his commitment to God? For God to say about him, he is a just man. If there's anything I long to hear on that great and final day, Ty was a just guy. He did his best. Noah was that guy. Noah preached 120 years. 120 years and not one convert. That's amazing. Nobody listened. He was alone. Now add to that number 5. This one's really important too. Noah had faith for 120 years and beyond. Now, 120 years wasn't the extent of his life on earth, but we know that he preached for 120 years before that flood actually came. And so 120 years and beyond, Noah and his family were alone. There wasn't a congregation that met around Mount Ararat, right? There wasn't the Mount Ararat Church of Christ for Noah to go and be around 150 other brethren on Sunday and Wednesday and in the middle of the week. Noah didn't have that. He was alone for 120 years and beyond. How few Christians do you know that could endure that today? Could you? No one but you and your family. You know, I know someone who's been praying for 5 days. For 5 days. And they came to me this morning in my office and said, Ty, the Lord must not be hearing my prayers. 5 days he prayed and he already gave up. Noah, 120 years by himself. Someone says, Ty, I've been praying for 20 years for my husband. Add 100 to that. Could you handle it? 100 years, 120 years of being by your own. And here's what I guess I've learned in my own faith. When things don't seem to be going my way, or at least the way that I think it should be when it comes to my faith and how difficult it is to endure, especially in difficult circumstances, when the people around me don't see the same things that I see and they don't want the same things that I want, and how hard it is to keep going, Noah's faith didn't get feeble like mine does. Noah's faith got stronger. How? How could Noah do that? How could he last? How could he endure the way that he did? And this is what I love about him so much. He went on in preaching, and he went on in praying, and he went on in serving without any doubts that in his own time, in God's own time, that Noah would be justified in the eyes of his critics. He knew that. He believed that. Everyone that said, Noah, you're crazy, Noah knew that God was going to make good on his promises. And for 120 years and beyond, by himself, Noah resolved to stay faithful to God. Man, what a man. Number 6, let's notice this. Noah had faith enough to be separate from the world. Noah had faith enough to be separate from the world. You know, Heidi and I, we've been in Florence for 3.5 years now, and we said that we were going to live in an apartment for 2 years before we were going to buy a house. 2 years. And our 2 years was up a year and a half ago, and we cannot get a house in Florence. It is bidding wars. And we're first-time home buyers, and we've been trying. And right now, what's going to happen is we're going to have to settle for something less than what we wanted. It's not going to be ideal for us. It's not what we were looking for, but that's just the reality of it. I can't imagine that Noah woke up and said, man, I just can't wait to live in that ark, man, for 150 days. Have tar all over my walls, tar holding my door up, animals stinking up the place, and having to get up and feed them. I don't imagine. You think Noah's wife was happy? Man, looking at houses with Heidi, she's got too much Chip and Joanna in her. She couldn't have handled the ark, man. You know, it would have been hard for her to live like that. It would have been hard for me to live like that, to endure the things that Noah had to live. It was covered within and without with nasty pitch is what it is, tar. That's all it is. Just held everything together. I don't know where the window was placed. I do know it had one door, right? And we know it had one window. I don't know if it was a long window above the top. That way the light could get in. I don't know if it was one window on the side. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But one window and one door. That would have been hard. I like to look out the window from time to time when I'm at the house. I have no doubt in my mind that the world looked at Noah and said, you're insane, man. You're insane. Why would you shut yourself in that place? But see, what happened was Noah didn't shut himself in there. God did. God put him in there. God allowed him to be in there. God gave him that place to live and to thrive and to survive and eventually start over all new. He gave him a brand new opportunity to be the founder and the father of a new world. Essentially, he gave Noah that place. When Noah went in, he was dead to the world. When that door was shut, Noah was separated from the world, much like we reenact baptism. When we are buried in the water, we're dead to the world, we sing. Dead to the old life of folly and sin is what we sing. When Noah went in the ark, the world was forgotten. The world as Noah's family knew it was absolutely forgotten. And let me tell you something. Nowadays, folks don't like to be separated from the world. Christians don't like to be separated from the world. You tell them, hey, there's one door. They'd like to have 2 or 3 doors that they can slip in and out, right? To do a little bit in the world and then come back and be in the ark, and then a little bit in the world and then come back and be in the ark, and act like I'm a saint when I'm in the ark and act like I'm in the world when I'm not. And Christians just don't like to be separated from the world anymore, not Noah. When he went in, he died to the world. The world was long gone. The world was forgotten. How few endure being separated from the world. And this is what I love about Noah. Noah willingly accepted being separated from the world because he knew that was an integral part of his salvation. No separation, no salvation. That one's hard. It's hard. There's so many things about life that just draw our attention. That's the human in us. And I pray that I can develop the resolve like Noah to completely separate myself from the world, to be committed to God in the ordinary things, to take serious the warnings of God, to realize, hey, this isn't, it's bigger than me. I'm living for something bigger than me. In the world, they criticize me and they don't understand, and it didn't stop Noah. So just briefly then, let's consider those few other things. I have a couple of more I'll keep going, but we'll just go back to these fear and obedience, because maybe that needs to be mentioned. Fear was his motivation. Read on in verse number 7. By faith, Noah, that's where we've been this whole time, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. Now, notice this next phrase, in reverent fear. I stand in awe of you. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension. More than we've ever seen or heard is essentially the idea. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depths of your love? You're beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above, and I stand in awe of you. Noah, by faith, was warned by God about things yet unseen, and by reverent fear. When Noah entered into the presence of God, he trembled. He fell on his face. He was honored. He cried. You know the song, I Can Only Imagine? I can only imagine what it will be like. Will I sing? Will I shout? Will I be silent? Will I say anything? Will I fall down? Will I stand up? Will I dance? I don't know. But I'm in awe of being in your presence. Noah says, faith is my foundation. Every day I live out my commitment to God. No stopping me, no changing my mind. From 120 years to 120,000 years, I stand in awe of you. Look at the result. Constructed an ark. He obeyed. God said in Genesis 6 and verse 15, this is how you are to make the ark. Noah had a standard that he had to abide by, a set of rules or guidelines. God says, this is how you do it, and Noah did it. He did all the things that God commanded him. Genesis chapter 6 and verse number 22. He did all that God commanded him. Noah obeyed. Number one, he obeyed completely. Genesis 6 and verse 22. He did all that God commanded him. Number two, he obeyed carefully. That's verse 15. This is how you are to make it. I think about the standard that God gave. You build it out of gopher wood. You build it this length and this height, and you make sure the window is this big and the door is this big, and all of these things that God gave. Why? Why did he give those things to Noah? Because that's what God wanted. It wasn't in Noah to question. It wasn't in Noah to wonder. It wasn't in Noah to give his opinion. God said, this is what you need to be saved. And we could argue all day long. What would have happened had Noah not obeyed exactly or carefully? We could argue all day. We could say, well, Noah's family wouldn't have been saved if he didn't obey. We could. But here's what I do know. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't, but I do know that God blessed him because he did. And that's enough for me. You say, Ty, why do we have to sing instead of play instruments? Well, we could argue all day. The Bible doesn't say that we can't have instruments, right? But I do know the Bible does say sing. So I'm going to sing. Why do I have to be immersed in water for the remission of my sins? I could argue all day why sprinkling might be a good cause or why it would be okay to just say the sinner's prayer. But God said, you be baptized for the remission of your sins, and I'm going to be baptized for the remission of my sins because that's what God said. That's what I'm going to do. Noah said, God, whatever you say goes. It's not in me to argue. It's not in me to question. I'm going to obey you completely, and I'm going to obey you carefully. I'm going to pay close attention to what you say because that's going to govern my life and how I live, not anybody else. Noah obeyed completely. What I mean by that is he obeyed at all costs. It must have been hard for Noah to set aside time to build the ark. It must have been extremely hard on Noah because I'm sure Noah didn't have a crane or Noah didn't have construction equipment. Noah didn't have power tools. Man, it would have been hard for Noah to build. It cost him a lot physically. I'm sure it cost him a lot emotionally because in order for him to build a boat that size, I'm sure that he had to spend time away from his family. It hurt his family. I'm sure that he had to spend time away from doing the things that he would have normally been doing. And on top of that, he's explaining to everyone, listen, I'm building this for you. You can be saved just like me. Noah obeyed at all costs. I'm sure Noah lost friends. I'm sure Noah lost family. I'm sure Noah lost possessions. I'm sure he lost his house, his job, everything he loved. But Noah obeyed. You know what happened? Results did not fail to come. Look at verse 7. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. Noah's faith paid off. It didn't matter how long Noah lived on the earth. If he would have lived 20 years or 220 years or 200,020 years, Noah's faith paid off. Being obedient to God pays off. And I know that's hard to see right now. I can imagine being in Noah's shoes. God, I'm down here by myself. Everyone hates me. Everyone's ridiculing my family. They're saying how crazy I am for being committed to you. But I'm still going to love you because I'm in awe of you. And I believe that you'll make good on your promises. God, you already have. And I know what'll happen if I don't. It doesn't matter how long it takes, God, I'll be faithful. I pray that you and I can develop that kind of faith. That kind of faith. You know, I had 3 or 4 different outlines. Didn't know which direction I wanted to go. There was a lot of different ways I think we could have. But I want you to turn your attention to Genesis chapter 6 for just a moment. I want to conclude by pointing out this one thing. Go to Genesis chapter 6. And let's start in verse number 14. He says, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. That's important for us to notice, that word, make yourself. In other words, there was a responsibility that Noah had for himself. You and I have a responsibility to build our faith tonight. We have God's going to do his part. You and I have a responsibility to do our part. Make yourself an ark. Make the rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you are to make it. In other words, this is the standard that you ought to follow. You have a responsibility to build your faith, and this is how you build your faith. Do it just like I tell you. Verse 17, for behold, I'll bring the floodwaters on the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that's on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives, and of every living thing, of all flesh, you will bring 2 of every sort in the ark to keep them alive with you, and they shall be male and female. Now listen to this. This is really important. Of the birds according to their kinds, and the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing on the ground, according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come to you to keep them alive. I've never noticed that phrase until in preparation for this lesson tonight. What I understand from Genesis 6 and verse 22, when God says, you build the ark, the animals will come. You ever seen the Field of Dreams? Build it and they will come. That mentality doesn't always work in the faith, but for Noah it did. You build it and I'll come. In other words, Noah had to step out in faith. Noah had to. And God paid him for it. God blessed him for it. And maybe you're like me. And you're waiting on something in your faith. You've put it all in God's hands. You've given it to God. Step out in faith and watch God work. Watch God work. Look what happens in verse 21. And take every sort of food that's eaten and store it up. That's really important too. Prepare for the future, Noah. Make yourself an ark. You have a responsibility. Do it in this way and step out in faith and I'll bless you. That's biblical, right? Genesis 22. Abraham, you kill your son Isaac on that altar. Go up to Mount Moriah and kill your son. Abraham goes up Mount Moriah. He's about to kill his son, and what happens? God provides a ram. Abraham steps out, God provides. Peter, he jumps out of the boat on the water to go meet Jesus. Peter steps out and he starts to stink. What happened? God provides. Noah, you build the ark, and I'll make sure those animals get to you. And oh, by the way, Noah, prepare. Store it up. Get everything that you need. Invest in your life. Invest in your eternity. My advice to us tonight, I guess, is this. As we consider Noah's faith, those 6 elements of his faith that were fundamental to who Noah was and the reason why we're studying him tonight, that grew into this reverent respect for God, that when Noah entered into God's presence, he was in awe of him. I pray not only that we have faith, but our faith grows into fear. And then, as a result of our faith and our fear, that obedience is the result. That we're not Sunday Christians and we're not Wednesday Christians, but we're committed to Jesus every day. And that when people malign us and they misunderstand us and they criticize us for who we are and what we do, we don't waver because we know God's going to make good on his promises. My grandfather, favorite preacher of all time, he always used to say this. It seemed like he said it every sermon, but he said, God, the promise maker, is always God the promise keeper. Always. I pray that we'll have faith like Noah. Maybe you're here tonight and you're struggling in your faith. Maybe it's not an everyday kind of faith, you know. Maybe it's one of those faith that wavers from time to time, or even in the face of opposition, or when the world around you seems to be a little bit difficult and nobody understands why you're here on a Monday night to study about Noah. They question why you missed out, maybe on a ball game, or maybe on, I don't know. If we were in Alabama tonight, Alabama's playing softball, so I know where some people would have been. They question why you make a commitment to the Lord. Don't back down. Trust in God's ability and His promises to come through and make good on what He said. Maybe you are not a Christian. Maybe you've never expressed your faith in God. Maybe you've never acted on that, rather. Maybe you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, or maybe you've never just really taken the moment to consider the blessings of being a Christian. You have that opportunity tonight to consider the faith of Noah and how that paid off in the long run for him. His family was saved. You can be saved tonight. If just like Noah, you'll pass through the water, Peter says, just as 8 souls were saved through water, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21, the like figure that now does save us is baptism. You have the opportunity tonight not to wash away the filth of your flesh, but the answer of a good conscience before God. Maybe that's what you desire tonight. You have the opportunity to do that in faith in Jesus Christ as we stand and as we sing.